Hello and welcome to Just in Time, Module 2, Disaster Behavioral Health. This module is meant to be taken after completing Psychological First Aid and Module 1 of Just in Time, the overview of the Disaster Distress Helpline. If you've taken both of those already, then welcome back. Module 2, for this module, we want to continue thinking and talking a bit about self-care, and then build on what you learned in psychological first aid in relation to disaster behavioral health, putting it in the context of DDH calls and texts that you'll be receiving as part of the DDH network. We're going to look more specifically as well at the effects of disasters on young folks and potential severe reactions of those affected by disasters. And so to begin, we're going to look at self-care, building on what we talked about in Module 1. And we're going to look at self-care in two different lights. We're going to look at it in a proactive sense, so the self-care that we practice regularly on a daily or weekly or monthly or even annual basis, and also reactive self-care, when things become extra challenging, stressful, or overwhelming, what we can do either more of or other things we can do to help us in those times. And so to help us think about this, I'm going to ask you to think about 3 questions and to remember that all of us practice self-care. In some ways we're aware of, in some ways we might not even be aware of or might not identify as self-care. But all of us practice self-care in a number of different ways regularly, even without realizing it. And so we want to pause and take an opportunity to think about how we practice self-care, both proactively on a regular basis and when things get especially challenging or difficult, such as after a stressful call or text. And in the same way that we support callers and texters to the Disaster Distress Helpline, we want to come from a strengths-based approach and think about the resources that we already have and are using, whether we are aware of them or not. And so just like we would ask a texter or caller to DDH, what are some of the things that you do when you feel very stressed, anxious, etc., already or now since the disaster happened? We're going to ask you to think about these 3 questions in terms of what you already do. So we're going to ask you to think about 3 things and identify 3 things that you do on a regular basis in terms of self-care. Ideally, these are things that help you in a positive or healthy way. So 3 things that you already do or can do in terms of practicing self-care. We want you to think about those times when you've been especially stressed or especially challenged or overwhelmed, and what are some of the things that you do in those times that help you in terms of self-care and build up your resiliency to cope with more challenging times and situations. What are some of the things you do regularly in those times or can do moving forward? And we also want you to think about some of the things that your agency or call center or even the Disaster Distress Helpline can do. What resources or coping skills or tips or self-care practices might be available that your agency and or DDH can help you with moving forward? So we'd like you to come up with 3 answers to each of those questions, and the next time we touch base on self-care, we're going to talk about some of the specific ways that we can practice self-care and some specific strategies for doing so. And so moving on from your self-care homework assignment, we want to provide an introduction and overview to some of the key concepts that are behind disaster behavioral health. And these are important because a lot of these concepts really influence the standards and training and practices of the Disaster Distress Helpline and the services that we provide. So we're going to go over some of these in a bit more detail than others, but we want to start off with the fact that no one who experiences a disaster is untouched by it, although of course everyone that's affected by a disaster is affected in different ways to different levels. Now of course we know that some folks are directly affected by disasters, folks who are in the immediate impacted area. But the Disaster Distress Helpline as a national resource is also just as much available to support disaster responders, first responders, and anyone else who helps those affected by disasters, as well as loved ones of disasters, even if they're on the other side of the country from those who were directly affected. For example, after the Boston Marathon bombing in April of 2013, the Disaster Distress Helpline received numerous calls and texts from parents and grandparents of college students in Boston who were calling because they were experiencing high levels of anxiety and distress, either because they couldn't get in touch with their loved ones in Boston or because they had and their loved ones seemed to be not coping well. We know that a lot of times people pull together and function during and after disasters, but their effectiveness can be diminished to a smaller, greater extent. We know that mental health concerns exist in relation to disasters before, during, and after disasters occur. And so it's important to remember that DDH is available 24/7, 365 for folks who might be experiencing distress when they hear a warning or see a forecast of a potential disaster, during the immediate impact of a disaster, immediately afterwards, or even long after. Some disasters have a long-term recovery period. And we know that anniversaries of disasters and other events can trigger distress as well. And it's an important piece to remember with disaster behavioral health, because we're going to see a whole range of calls from people affected by all types of disasters at different timelines. And we know with the last bullet point here, and this is one of the key pieces to remember in terms of supporting survivors of disasters, we've seen it again and again in our work, that this simple fact, that very often what folks who are survivors of disasters are feeling are normal responses, common responses to abnormal situations, like an incident of mass violence, like a tornado, like a hurricane, like a plane crash. That the responses that they're feeling are common responses, are normal responses to an abnormal situation of a disaster. And we've seen again and again that sharing this information, that validating what folks are feeling and what their reactions are, and reminding them or educating them that these are normal responses to an abnormal situation, can be one of the most effective tools in alleviating a survivor's distress. Additional concepts of disaster behavioral health that we can look at and remember include that survivors of disasters, like most folks, respond to active and genuine interest and concern in how they're doing. And we also know that very often disaster mental health and disaster crisis counseling and the assistance given by a resource like the Disaster Distress Helpline and practitioners of psychological first aid and other models tends to be more practical than psychological in nature. If you remember from the psychological first aid training, a lot of the beginning or the entirety of delivering psychological first aid can include things like offering a phone to someone to try and contact a loved one, distributing coffee or water or food to folks in a shelter, as well as some of the things that we do through phone and text at the Disaster Distress Helpline: active listening, encouragement, reassuring folks, comforting them, including connecting them to disaster-specific resources for follow-up support as needed. And last but not least, it's important to remember that disaster relief assistance, whatever form it may come in, that's available to survivors of a disaster, can often be confusing and at times can increase frustration and anxiety and distress in and of itself. A lot of times the local, federal, or state or nonprofit disaster assistance programs that are available after disasters can be frustrating to navigate. They can lead to greater levels of distress, frustration, anxiety or anger, and increased feelings of helplessness related to the types of assistance that a survivor might need. And for some folks, this frustration might increase to the point where they are rejecting any type of assistance at all. They might refuse or not be able to evacuate from an unsafe situation. And we know that the connecting to a resource like the Disaster Distress Helpline, even a 5-minute conversation through phone or text, can go a long way to helping someone reduce their frustration, their anxiety, their distress to a level where they are able to make a plan to take that next step to move forward on the path to safety and or recovery. So we want to look at some of the risk factors for higher levels of disaster distress that might be present in the calls or texts that we receive as part of the Disaster Distress Helpline. And risk in this context relates to how vulnerable a survivor of a disaster is to the 4 reaction domains, as we'll describe them. And those are emotional reactions, behavioral reactions, physical reactions, and cognitive reactions. And it's important for us to talk about these in a greater level of detail, because these are some of the clues that you're going to be listening for in calls and looking for in texts that are going to help us identify how many risk factors are present for higher levels of distress in callers and texters. The groups or populations that the Disaster Distress Helpline primarily serves, and those groups that are at higher levels of potential risk for distress related to disasters, are, of course, those survivors that are directly affected by a disaster, as well as rescue and recovery workers that work not one but multiple deployments in disasters, loved ones of victims and survivors, whether they are inside or outside impacted areas, as well as the public at large that can be affected through media and in other ways as well. And so to start this conversation off, we're going to look at some of the specific risk factors that might put people at higher levels of vulnerability for distress relating to a disaster. And we're going to talk about some of these in a bit more detail. Exposure. Proximity to the disaster itself is an important one, because very often the closer one is to the point of impact, the greater the likelihood for potential trauma. We know that folks directly affected by a hurricane, a fire, an earthquake, other similar disasters, and their families are often at greatest risk for emotional reactions, including less common reactions after disasters such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Multiple losses, such as the loss of income, identity, a job, a loved one, a pet, a sense of loss of purpose, concrete losses like home, like one's home or community, can lead to increased risk for disaster distress. Re-traumatization is something we see very often from callers and texters to the Disaster Distress Helpline. And this can be survivors of previous disasters being re-traumatized by current disasters. We know that survivors of Sandy, some survivors of Hurricane Sandy in 2012 had already experienced prior disasters, including other hurricanes such as Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, and Gustav. And we also know that there are, for example, we know from the ACE study that 1 in 4 people have experienced trauma during childhood, and that can range from sexual abuse and physical abuse to witnessing violence or abuse. And disasters can cause re-traumatization for folks who have that kind of history as well. And so these folks might be at increased risk for adverse reactions, and also may have pre-existing mental health, substance use, or physical health conditions. We know that folks who have few or no supports, survivors who are isolated, who don't rely on others for support or assistance, such as single parents or folks with no support, are often at greater risk for disaster distress as well. And so in addition to general risk factors that can lead to higher potential levels of distress, it's also important to be aware of specific events related to disasters that may have implications for distress and mental health, including some of these here. And if you'll notice, this list is written in general chronological order. Evacuation, the ending of search and rescue for loved ones or missing folks, and death notifications of those whose lives may have been lost related to a disaster usually occur in the impact and immediate aftermath of a disaster. Returning to an impacted area, to your block, to your community, to your school, as well as funerals and memorials, remembering those who have lost their lives, tend to happen a little bit further out from the disaster. And then the reopening of public facilities and anniversary and trigger events, as well as media coverage of reopenings and anniversary and trigger events, tend to happen later on. And we want to look a little bit just for a second at anniversary and trigger events. We know these can often cause higher levels of individual and community anxiety for folks, as well as other reactions. And because the Disaster Distress Helpline is the only national resource available 24/7, 365 for survivors of disaster, we often see an increase in volume around trigger events and anniversaries. And so it is important to really be able to educate callers and texters to DDH about the expected reactions and triggers that can come with such events. And DDH has materials, and there are other resources available that can provide information on concrete strategies and tips for helping folks cope with disaster anniversaries, and you can even share some of those with callers and texters as appropriate. Now, while remembering that just like disasters, all survivors' experiences are different, and even the same survivor's experience can be different over time. And so it becomes important to remind people that they can call the disaster distress helpline back as often as they need to, or text DDH as often as they need to. And so we're going to spend some time looking at the phases of disasters. This might be a review for some of you, but this is a visual representation of the phases of disasters, including some of the common reactions and emotional reactions specifically that individuals and communities feel. And so you can see the phases of a disaster, including a warning or pre-impact phase, leading up to the impact phase, where you can see the heroic response leading up to a honeymoon feeling, where the community comes together to help and support each other, is followed by a relatively large drop in terms of disillusionment, in terms of the emotional state and well-being of individuals and communities affected. And then begins the long-term process of what we often refer to as short-term and long-term recovery, where individuals are going to be working through their grief, coming to terms with what's happened. You can see here noted the trigger events and anniversary reactions as dips, we talked about in the previous slide. And then eventually, and this is the goal of Disaster Distress Helpline again, is to help folks get to a place where they can recover to the point where they are able to move forward with their new normal, as we say after disasters, is that things aren't necessarily going to go back to the way that they were before a disaster, and it's about adjusting to the new normal. So while we look at this chart, we want to remember that while this is a common trajectory for individuals and for families and communities that are affected by disasters, there is no specific timeline associated with each phase. Every person, every family, every community, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, state by state, within a singular disaster event may progress at different speeds in terms of recovery. For example, 6 months after Hurricane Sandy, some communities were still in the coming to terms phase with the disaster, while others were already in the reconstruction and the new normal phase of the disaster. And there can also be overlap in these phases, right? There can be disillusionment during the honeymoon phase as well for different folks who experience the disaster differently. And so we're going to dial down for a little bit on disaster crisis counseling in specific phases of disaster. And we're going to look at some of the more common reactions during key phases of a disaster. And remember, this is leading us to get a sense of what types of calls and texts and presenting issues we're going to be seeing. So the beginning, right, the initial phases, both pre-impact and the impact disaster, which can be weeks, days, or hours before a disaster's impact, and the actual impact of a disaster. And impact is obviously going to look differently depending on the type of disaster we're talking about. These are some of the common reactions that we're going to see during these phases, right? Anxiety, fear, and confusion, whether it's regarding evacuation orders, warnings of a disaster impending, the media coverage related to a disaster, distress triggers from experiences with those similar disasters in the past. The Disaster Distress Helpline, for example, received a lot of calls from folks that weren't in the projected path of Hurricane Sandy, but had been affected by previous hurricanes in other areas and were being triggered and were experiencing high levels of distress simply because of the media coverage of the impact of Hurricane Sandy. And again, it can also be folks who are concerned for loved ones inside the threatened or impacted areas, like we saw with the Boston Marathon bombing. During the heroic and honeymoon phases, right, which can be during the impact of a disaster or in the hours, days, weeks, and months after a disaster, very often we're seeing an increase in calls from folks who are seeking volunteer opportunities and ways to donate and help those that were directly affected. And then we have that disillusionment phase, which was that steep decline on the chart that we were looking at in terms of phases of disaster. And that can last from days to weeks to even years after a disaster. And some of the emotional reactions that we see there, the more common reactions, you might you probably can guess most of them, but we're seeing a lot of anger and frustration. We're seeing sense of isolation. We're seeing hopelessness. We're seeing real difficulties adjusting to that new normal. We're seeing exhaustion and fatigue from struggling for days and weeks and months with the situation and with all of the effects of the disaster, concrete and emotional. And we're also seeing a lot of these feelings and concerns also for children or others, loved ones, especially from caregivers, whether that's someone taking care of a child or someone with a disability or elderly relative, etc. And so let's take some of this and really put it in a very concrete context. When we're talking about these three initial phases, what are some of the common presenting issues that we see specifically in the disaster distress helpline? And so what we want to do is share some of the common presenting issues in the voice of callers and texters to DDH themselves. So we're going to share some of the texts that we've received over the first 2 years of the disaster distress helpline, illustrating some of the more common presenting issues, dependent obviously on disaster type and area affected. And we're going to use the actual language. Typos were left in, they're intentional, although of course identifying information was changed to protect people's identities. And the actual text, even though we're using all examples from text, the disaster distress helpline, they really mirror a lot of what our network sees from callers as well. And so feel free for these slides and any others, of course, during any of these modules to pause as needed so you can go back and read some of the information that is listed here. We're not going to go through and read each of these. But one of the more common presenting issues that we see, especially pre-impact, right? So with the warning or forecast of a major disaster, and usually the types of disasters we have warnings for or forecasts for are severe weather incidents. So a hurricane is an example of a type of disaster. We may have a warning of days and even a week or so before the disaster impacts an area. And so we tend to see a lot of anxiety and confusion in the face of those types of severe weather forecasts. People who say that they're having panic attacks, freaking out about the hurricane coming, can't seem to focus and push the storm back for a bit to get myself back in control. Someone else texted in wanting to know what time Sandy hits land and how strong it's going to be. What do I do for people that I care about who aren't preparing for Hurricane Sandy? I'm so terrified of the storms. Is there any ideas that you might have to try and stay calm for my daughter and for myself? These are all from the week before impact of Hurricane Sandy. And you can see here some of the more overt and some of the more subtle presentations of distress coming through in concern for others, coming through in concern and anxiety around their own reactions. We tend to see very often that caregivers are at higher potential risk for distress, but also it's a population, caregivers is a population where we tend to see that they are more likely to reach out more often to a resource like the disaster distress helpline. So in addition to overwhelming feelings of anxiety and confusion in the face of a forecast of a disaster, we see calls and texts come in from folks in distress relating to evacuation and to immediate post-disaster response. And again, we see this a lot with caregivers as well, because if you are a caregiver, you obviously have to think of more than just yourself in terms of an evacuation or a shelter plan, etc. We can see folks, this is the first one is from in relation to the Newtown, Connecticut shooting in December of 2012. A parent who is wondering how to have the discussion about what happened with their children. And you can see the second two are also related to Hurricane Sandy and wanting to know how hard their town's going to get hit because they have children. And another, again, a situation where there are medical needs and a lot of overlapping needs from people that are calling in. And so helping people to get a better sense of their immediate next step plans to break things down step by step by step can be one of the more effective strategies when working with folks who are presenting with multiple issues and concerns. Some of the next few phases, if you'll remember from the chart, include working through grief, the coming to terms phase, and the reconstruction phase, right? The weeks and months and years after a disaster, building back towards a new normal. We know that recovery can be set back with trigger events and anniversaries. Those are those dips that you might remember from the chart that we saw. And we know that new disasters or other non-disaster traumas or life events can interfere with recovery as well. And we talked a lot about trigger events and anniversary reactions already. We tend to see the same kind of emotional reactions as we do during the disillusionment phase. Um, and we get calls and texts from folks who are having trouble with the recovery process, and those folks are particularly vulnerable to distress during trigger events and anniversaries. And with those, we're going to see flashbacks very often, periods of intense mourning and grief, and other reactions as well. And then we also have our peacetime presenting issues. Folks who might call just seeking information about services, folks who have other mental health concerns that don't at least present as related to a specific disaster, although they might be, and that's not the presenting issue that they chose to share with the disaster distress helpline, and folks who are really having a tough time over a long period of time, folks who are still being affected by disasters and experiencing distress from a disaster which might have occurred 1 to 5, 10 years before. So with some of with these phases, some of the presenting issues that we've seen with the disaster distress helpline, and we see this very often with the warning or impact, forecast or impact of a major scale disaster. But folks where current disasters that aren't affecting them, they're not in the area of impact, but they're triggering very painful memories of past experience with other disasters. And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of folks affected by Hurricane Katrina contacted the disaster distress helpline having been triggered by the news and the coverage and the effects of Hurricane Sandy. It was something we saw very often, and we see it most often with hurricanes, or we have seen it most often to date with the disaster distress helpline in the context of hurricanes and incidents of mass violence. When the Newtown, Connecticut shooting happened in 2014, we had a lot of callers call because they were triggered and were experiencing distress relating to their experiences being present at or being affected by the Virginia Tech shooting, the Aurora, Colorado shooting, the Columbine shooting, and others as well. And they'll bring these up actively in the calls and texts that you get. Another common issue that we see is people sharing feelings of despair, hopelessness relating to economic loss due to the disaster, and connected to that, right, uncertainty about the future. And a lot of times this is going to come out very concretely. And obviously one of the big triggers with this in terms of higher levels of distress can be if they're not eligible for certain types of assistance or if their claims for assistance are denied. And so supporting people with the reality of that and how to move forward can be a very important skill for disaster distress helpline crisis counselors. Another presenting issue that we see that we talked about is a risk for higher levels of distress or mental health implications. Can be multiple stressors, some relating to the disaster directly, some indirectly, and some not at all. And this can challenge that recovery over the weeks, months, and years post-disaster as well. So we have an example here in terms of, I believe this was Hurricane Sandy, of a recent survivor of domestic violence who was just getting back on their feet and now are having trouble struggling with the recent storm that hit as well. Family issues, other traumas, other mental health issues and concerns come up very often in disaster distress helpline calls and can again be a risk for greater levels of distress. Another issue we see very often is in the longer term recovery, really difficulties adjusting to some of the challenges of long-term recoveries after a disaster, or adjusting to the idea that very often disasters will lead to a new normal based on the different effects of different types of disasters. Again, DDH is the only national resource available 24/7, 365 to survivors of disasters. So we are a very important resource for long-term recovery. This second scenario here that we've shared, text that we've shared, was, I believe, someone texting about 8 or 9 months out after Sandy, and they'd obviously been affected also by Hurricane Irene the year before as well. And you can see some of these multiple traumatizations and challenges, as well as that new normal. Of course, it's going to be difficult adjusting to a new normal if you had just adjusted and Sandy came through and you lost everything again. So hopefully these gave you a bit of a sense of the concrete presenting issues, especially in response or after a large-scale disaster happens, that we see from callers and texters to the disaster distress helpline. And so with that, we want to take a step back and just give an overview of the 4 domains of reactions. Of course, these domains are going to overlap, and these reactions will overlap with each other in terms of domains. And many survivors at different phases of after a disaster are going to experience a range that can increase and decrease over time in terms of their reactions. And so the 4 domains, as we mentioned before, are emotional, behavioral, physical, and cognitive. And some of the key points we want to remember in terms of survivor reactions to disasters is that most people who are affected by a disaster will have mild to moderate distress reactions in one or more of these domains. That all of these are very often common reactions to an abnormal situation, as we've said before, and that's a key piece of education to share with survivors of disasters. And this last piece, temporary, it's very important to know and to share with callers and texters, or to have in mind, not necessarily to share unless appropriate, but it's important to remember that most people affected by disasters bounce back. Individuals, families, communities, we are naturally resilient, and very often we bounce back on our own. And at the same time, some folks might struggle with how long it's taking to bounce back. Some might have some of the risk factors we've talked about in terms of mental health implications and other implications that might make it more difficult for them to bounce back. And that's why it's important for them to have resources like the Disaster Distress Helpline at their disposal. But because we as individuals and communities are naturally resilient, we want to remember to not only focus on the presenting issues and the challenges, but we also want to remember to listen for and ask about potential positive reactions and resources and strengths as appropriate. And so we want to touch base briefly on post-traumatic growth and make sure that we want to emphasize that while, of course, given the nature of the support that we provide, we understandably often focus on negative aspects of disasters and the challenges that callers and texters might be experiencing, that a lot of times disasters also have conscious or unconscious beneficial consequences for folks affected. And so while it's one thing for disaster distress helpline crisis counselors and the work you all do to facilitate recognition of these growth factors, it's also important to be aware that we don't want to make callers or texters feel as if we're trying to get them to, simply think more positively. Some callers or texters may cite growth as a source of anxiety or confusion. We've heard folks say things like, everyone around me is so sad, but I actually feel kind of happy because I survived, which then makes me feel guilty. Is that wrong? And so you want to think about how you can respond to and or frame these type of things. It really is, remind folks that it is a common reaction to feel this way, and it's okay to feel happy that you survived, and other people feel like that as well. That's a normal reaction to these types of situations. And then you can explore a bit more about the feeling guilty piece and why they think that might feel wrong. Some other key examples of post-traumatic growth to be aware of and to look out for and to help identify in terms of the 4 domains of reactions, again, emotionally, feelings of hope, determination, and gratitude. Behaviorally, people might be feeling stronger or have reinforced coping skills. They might be motivated to engage in disaster preparedness, which can often be a great emotional support for people affected by disasters. A lot of times disasters force us to spend more time with our neighbors, our community, our loved ones, our family, and promote this idea of this sense of togetherness and support for each other. In terms of cognitive post-traumatic growth reactions, a lot of times people might have a positive outlook after a disaster, right? We made it through this, and if we can make it through this, right, a stronger sense of self-efficacy and confidence, commitment to different positive changes in their life, and a recognition of what's really important to you, right? A lot of times disasters or other traumatic events can help us recognize what really is most important to us in our lives. And physically, there can be post-traumatic growth-related reactions as well in terms of greater adrenaline and increased energy and being and feeling more active. So just as we want to hold on to some of the positive pieces of post-traumatic growth and help callers and texters be able to identify them. We're going to dial down a little bit more on the 4 domains of reactions and really try and suss out and just be aware of them so that, again, we're able to identify them as they come up and help folks understand that these are indeed common reactions and help them come up with some ways to cope. In terms of emotional reactions, well, obviously there are a lot of these with disasters, and this can be a large part of folks' overall reactions to disasters. When a disaster happens, regardless really of what type of disaster it is, very often at the core of all of our reactions to a disaster is a lack of control and an increase in uncertainty in the world around us on a big scale and on a small scale as well. And with most major scale disasters, you're going to see successive losses that are going to lead to reactions in all 4 domains, but primarily emotionally in terms of high levels of anxiety and worry and fear, agitation and frustration, right? And it's related to that loss of identity or purpose or comfort or safety that we know comes with disasters. And so some of the pieces here, these lists, of course, are not all inclusive. There can be a wide range of reactions in each domain, but these are some of the key ones that we see very often and that we know are a part of disaster behavioral health and people's emotional reactions to disasters. Feeling isolated, anger and resentment, despair and hopelessness, and some of the other pieces here that we've talked about. In terms of behavioral reactions, there are a few key ones, though of course they can vary person to person, but a lot of times we might see increased irritability or outbursts of anger, including becoming easily upset or agitated, dreams or nightmares, distressing dreams or nightmares, isolation, again, self-isolation, right? Avoiding people and places or things related to the disaster specifically. Hypervigilance is very common after disasters, given the nature of some disasters, especially those without warning or forecast periods or pre-impact periods. And often it's a diminished ability to cope or to problem solve. And these are general behavioral reactions. More specifically with children, we're going to see very often a regression in behavior, such as going back to behaviors of thumb sucking or a need or desire to sleep with their parents, bedwetting, etc. With older young folks like teenagers, it might present as poor school performance, behaviors that are acting out, isolation, again, getting into trouble. And I want to stop for a second and talk about suicidal behavior. Suicidal behavior is not a very common reaction in disaster survivors, particularly in the weeks after a disaster. However, if you do have a suspicion that someone, a caller or texter, may be having trouble coping, feeling hopeless and helpless or isolated with no supports, of course, as per National Suicide Prevention Lifeline protocol and your own call center protocols, of course, always feel free to assess for suicide risk as per your suicide prevention assessment and training. So it's not common. We always want to, as appropriate, make sure that we're checking if you have any inclination to do so. In addition to behavioral reactions, there are other physical reactions, and these kind of somatic complaints, it can be really hard sometimes for folks affected by a disaster and folks in general to really understand that the emotional impact of an event can have actual physical effects and reactions in their bodies. And that's part of the general misunderstanding and stigmatization of mental health in society in general and in the context of disasters specifically as well, of course. So sharing that, the emotional impact of a disaster can have physical effects on you, can be an important piece of information, an important piece of psychoeducation to share with callers and texters who might be experiencing some physical reactions like we see here. Rapid breathing, pounding heart, sweating and headaches when thinking about the event or when confronted with media coverage or news about the event or hearing someone else speak about their experiences with the event. It can affect us in terms of upset stomachs, an increase or decrease in appetite, or other gastrointestinal problems as well. Of course, trouble sleeping can be a big part of physical reactions to a disaster, as well as a worsening of previous and chronic medical problems not necessarily related to the disaster. In terms of cognition, identifying and supporting some of the cognitive reactions folks are experiencing after disasters can be really important in post-disaster contexts because a lot of the types of assistance, financial assistance and others, have strict deadlines in terms of application and eligibility. So helping folks if they're having trouble concentrating or they have impaired memory or forgetfulness, then that might be something you really want to help them figure out some coping skills and tips on because of the nature of the application process for a lot of types of disaster-related assistance. Let's look at the 4 domains. Again, these lists are not exhaustive, and a lot of them kind of overlap with each other. And very often, remember that disaster survivors will be experiencing more than one reaction in one and more of these 4 domains. I want to take a second now to look at some of the disaster responses that we see specifically in children and teens. We know that there are a lot of populations and groups that are at higher potential risk, as we talked about, for distress related to disasters, and young folks, as well as other populations like elderly, frail, or isolated folks, are one of those groups. And given the high level of caregiver calls and texts that we get to DDH, we want to take some time and look at some of the specific disaster responses that we might see in children and teens. And so when appropriate, if you have a caller or texter who's describing parenting or caregiving responsibilities, you can use that as an opportunity to explore further, asking questions around, how old are the children and how are they doing? How are they coping? If some of these signs are present, and if the child isn't receiving professional counseling services, then a mental health assessment might be indicated. So as we talked about earlier, with younger kids, we might see regressive behaviors. A fear of separation is common, a clinginess or neediness, nightmares and trouble sleeping, as well as a move towards being less verbal and expressing themselves more through writings and drawings or play. Additionally, you can see sometimes, as we talked about, a decline in grades and trouble in school, as well as trouble concentrating in general, and frustration and anger, social withdrawal, acting out, conflict, high-risk behavior in teens, and some of these are obviously geared towards older young folks, teenagers. But depending on the age of the children, as you talk with folks through phone or text, depending on the age of the children involved, we're going to see, and you're going to help them understand there might be different reactions depending on the age of children that they might be aware of and might look for, and there are going to be different responses that they can give as well. And so you can think about how you can best support such caregivers. In terms of helping them understand these reactions and how best to cope with them. And always remembering, too, that even if they prevent with 100% of what they talk about and present is issues relating to the children, we want to remember that they can't help anyone if they're not helping themselves as well. So reminding them and checking in with how they're doing and what their coping tips and skills are for themselves, as well as an important piece of helping them care for their children, too. And so last but not least, we want to look at some of the more severe and psychopathological reactions that are possible when working with disaster survivors. Of course, in all things, we really want to remind you to follow your call centers as well as the National Suicide Prevention Lifelines, training and protocol in regards to risk assessment and support and more. And some of the resources that can be shared in situations, in calls or texts that do involve some of these more severe reactions, as a reminder, can be connecting them to their local National Suicide Prevention Lifeline call center or crisis line, as well as using the SAMHSA treatment locator for other resources that might be available to them locally as well for follow-up and for deeper levels of support. Some of the things that we're just going to take a quick look at include post-traumatic stress disorder, either an exacerbation of existing PTSD or developing it for the first time, anxiety and panic-related disorders, substance abuse disorders and addiction, as well as depressive disorders and suicidality. Taking a quick look at PTSD, we really want to just stop for a second before we get into the details and let you know that very often we will most likely not see PTSD develop in disaster survivors. It is really uncommon. It is rare to see PTSD develop in survivors of disasters. Although many folks may experience PTS symptoms and symptoms of distress. And the people that are most likely to experience PTSD in a disaster context are survivors and family members of those directly impacted, especially those that experienced a serious threat in terms of death, physical injury, and safety, a life-threatening injury experienced by themselves, or a witness to loss of life or other scenes of devastation. One of the reasons that the Boston Marathon bombing calls were so intense and had such a strong impact on the crisis counselors that answered them was because a lot of people that were calling were in high levels of distress from what they actually witnessed in terms of the graphic injuries of people that were injured or killed by the bombing at the marathon. And some of the traumatic reactions can look like some of the generalized reactions that we talked about earlier, but at a higher level in terms of intensity, in terms of fear and helplessness and horror, flashbacks, obviously, as well as avoidance and dissociation that we tend to see with PTSD. We want to really avoid diagnosing PTSD for some of the reasons we talked about, and because that is not one of the tasks or roles of the Disaster Distress Helpline and the disaster crisis counseling we provide, but use this discussion as an opportunity for psychoeducation around PTSD and mental health in general and some of the reactions that individuals might have, and encourage them to seek professional support. So now that we've looked at some of the risk factors that put people at greater risk for higher levels of distress related to disasters, we want to take a second and look at what are the actual tasks of recovery that we are aiming to help people with and support them through with the Disaster Distress Helpline. And so one of the first of those we just want to take a look at is helping folks return to a pre-disaster level of functioning. Now, why do we talk about that as a pre-disaster level of functioning specifically? Because even though, as we discussed, post-traumatic growth and some positive benefits or outcomes from a disaster are absolutely possible, at the same time, the goal for recovery is not to cure or solve any pre-existing issues or psychosocial issues that may have been present before the event. That is not the goal of the Disaster Distress Helpline or your task as a crisis counselor. The goal is to help them return to a pre-disaster level of functioning. And in order for folks affected by disasters to psychologically recover from the event, some of the things they really have to do and that we can help them with are, for children and teens, as we discussed, to resume age-appropriate roles, activities, and behaviors, to help folks regain a sense of mastery and control over their life, helping callers and texters take charge of their life through empowerment, through planning, through talking about next steps, setting goals, and following through with their goals. It can also be really helping folks adjust specifically, understand better what the new normal means and what it is for them, as well as helping them adjust to it, both a new normal, or possibly a new beginning as well. The loss of a home related to a disaster might require a person to relocate and establish a new life and routine, for example. So now that we have a sense of some of the key psychological tasks of recovery, we want to take a quick look at some of the main factors that can influence recovery. And these factors can either promote recovery or make recovery more challenging. One of the more obvious and important factors that influence recovery after a disaster is the nature of the disaster itself. Large-scale human-caused acts of mass violence or terrorism can often involve a more challenging recovery because of the fact that the event was an intentional crime. And so the risk for traumatic stress associated with directly experiencing the event is much greater. And we saw this with the Newtown, Connecticut shooting, with the Boston Marathon bombing as well, in terms of people's reactions when calling and texting the Disaster Distress Helpline. And the bottom line is really that the larger the event in size and scope of impact, the greater loss of life, the greater damage done to property, disruption to the fabric of an individual's, a family's, a community's life, then the more challenging the recovery process can be. We know that availability of family and social supports, that social network, is often one of the greatest factors in terms of recovery from a disaster. Some other key ones are primary language and literacy, and that ties into the location and accessibility of services provided. And that can look very different based on the transportation that's available, rural versus urban areas, and a lot of other factors that play into that, including folks that might have specific and special needs. And last but not least, and importantly, is also a willingness to access services. And so it's important to keep some of these things in mind in the big picture to help us best and most effectively support folks that do call or text DDH. And in the end, we really want to remember that recovery is possible with support, and keeping some of these key risk factors and domains of reactions in mind can help us identify those factors in each individual call or text that we take to help folks most effectively move forward on that path to recovery and bounce back after a disaster, adjusting to that new normal. So recovery is possible with support, with access to effective treatments, with resources like the Disaster Distress Helpline. And so with that, we want to end by just giving you a quick glimpse into some of the different types of disaster behavioral health support that are out there. The Disaster Distress Helpline, again, is the only national disaster behavioral health resource that is available 24/7, 365 to anyone affected by any kind of disaster. There are a few other key services and resources that you should know about and that you might actually hear about from callers and texters. These can include FEMA crisis counseling programs, or CCPs, that often have names like Project Hope, which is the New York State crisis counseling program for Sandy survivors, Project Hope and Healing in New Jersey. These are often temporary programs that are set up and offer on-the-ground, face-to-face, door-to-door supportive services. There are a lot of emotional and spiritual care providers, such as the American Red Cross, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, just to name two. Of course, there are a wide range of local mental health service providers that exist that can also provide services and support to survivors of disasters. And there are other crisis call lines. And some of them are even disaster specific. New Jersey, for example, has a state disaster crisis line that can be activated 24/7 as needed in response to specific disasters. And some of these resources we'll be sharing with you and are resources that you can then share as appropriate with callers and texters affected by specific disasters. And with that, we are going to end Module 2, and next up is Module 3, which will introduce you to Disaster Crisis Counseling and DDH's 4x4 Disaster Crisis Counseling model.